Good morning, my dear students. As first year students of literature, probably the question that first comes to your mind is, what is literature? Is it different from language? Do we need language for literature, or do we need literature for language? A definition of literature seems to be an impossibility, and down the ages, various writers, critics, thinkers, philosophers have attempted to define literature. Sometimes you begin with a very simple definition. You say great ideas, you say great language, and then you attempt to describe the chief characteristics of literature. Probably then you begin to think about universality, you begin to think about what the scope of literature should be, what the range of writing should be. But today we are going to try and look at literature in a different way. Today, in this lecture, we will be looking at literature, history, and medieval romance. I'll go back to my question, can literature be defined? As one writer put it very beautifully, some texts are born literary, some achieve literariness, some have literariness thrust upon them. So the moment a work is written, it doesn't automatically become literature. And that is why we say that literature is more a functional rather than an very obvious fixed term. It is functional. What do I mean by that? Have you looked at weeds in your garden? You know what weeds are? Little plants which really are upsetting, are coming in the way, are proving to be an obstacle for whatever we want to grow. Think of a garden. Think of rose plants planted in straight lines as far as your eyes can see. And there you have suddenly, let me use a common Gujarati word, you have probably a pudina growing up there. You probably have got dhania growing there. You consider them a weed because they come in the way of the growth of your rose bushes. But let's imagine that actually you've got fields and fields of dhania and pudina. Then they are not weeds. They are something that you plan to grow, that you have decided to grow, that you encourage probably by watering them, by giving them fertilizers. Do you understand? The word literature is also like that. It is a functional word. It is not a word that can be clearly defined. What is literature? Generally, most of us would like to imagine that all imaginative writing is literature. Now, when you think of maybe the plays of Shakespeare, you say, yes, it's imaginative writing. When you look at the essays of Charles Lamb, you probably say, yes, it is imaginative writing. You think of Donne, you think of Coleridge, Wordsworth, Chaucer, Keats, Tennyson, Dickens, Thackeray, and then you say, all this is literature. But my dear students, let me ask you a very simple question. Are all these only imaginative? Or somewhere does the line between fact and fiction get blurred? Yes, you say it is imaginative writing. Let's think of Charles Dickens maybe. Let's think of a book that you are probably familiar with. Let's think of David Copperfield. And you say that it is a novel. You say that it is imaginative writing. But can you all deny that it is based on the condition of Victorian England? Is it not a fact? So, when we talk about literature, it is not always necessarily only imagination. To put it as Arnold put it, you could probably say it's a criticism of life, which means somewhere you apply your ideas to the world around you, and therefore fact and fiction get blurred. In fact, when we look at Terry Eagleton's essay, What is Literature?, the question can be asked, do you consider newspaper reports to be fact? Do you consider all novels to be fact? Do you consider all good writing to be called literature because it is imaginative? No, my dear students, we have to understand that these two levels get blurred all the time. There is a difference probably between what we can call artistic truth and what we call historical truth. And therefore, literature is imaginative certainly, but it is also a combination of fact and fiction. The word novel itself means new. The word itself, novel, today we refer to fiction as novels. But the word novel at one stage was a combination of both artistic truth and historical truth. When you think of Gibbon, who was writing his history, he probably thought it was historical truth. But do you want to consider it merely as historical truth? Or somewhere do you want to call it art and therefore combine it with our concept of literature? Do we want to think of Superman? Do we want to think of Mills and Boon novels as literature just because they are imaginative? Or do we want to say that no, it's not literature because it is not of the standard that we call literature? So, when we attempt to define literature, the first three terms that come to our mind are that it is imaginative writing, that probably it's fictional, probably there's something novel, there's something new about it. Terry Eagleton, in his introductory essay, What is Literature?, begins with this question. And then he goes on to saying that maybe literature is not about themes. He says maybe what we need to really look at literature is to look at the way language is used. Maybe what we are looking at is not the theme. Maybe what we are not looking at is what it is about, what the characters are, who the characters are, what is the kind of milieu, what is the surrounding, what is the social surrounding. Maybe all that is not really important enough, he says, maybe not important enough to decide whether literature is literature, whether a work of art can be called literature. Maybe what we really need to look at is the use of language that is there in what we consider to be a literary text. Let me say that again to you, my dear students, to make it clearer. What we need to look at in any text which we want to consider to be literature is not the theme, is not what it is about, is not what the story is about, but instead to look at the use of language. And a Russian critic, Jacobson, put it very strongly when he said, organized violence committed on ordinary speech. Organized violence committed on ordinary speech. What do we mean? What do we mean by that? That there is a language which is ordinary language. There is a language which is everyday language. And what we are looking at is not the everyday speech. We are not looking at the everyday speech. We are looking at a specific use of language. We are looking at language being used in a different way. And Jacobson uses a rather strong term when he says it is organized violence. Because what we are trying to do is to use this language in a different way. When I say language, I'm not talking about English or Gujarati or Hindi. But what I mean is the particular language in which the literary text is being written, we do not use it the same way in which we use it in everyday language. And he puts it very beautifully, Eagleton, when he says, if somebody you meet at the bus stop addresses a young girl as unravished bride of quietness, you immediately know that this is not ordinary language. This is a kind of special language. Maybe this is a kind of literature. This is the kind of language that writers use in literature. Taking it a little further, we can say that in literature, he says, language believes in a particular organization. It believes in a specific laws. It believes in structures and devices. The language that is used in literature has laws which are different from everyday language. The structure that we use in literature is different. And that is why, my dear students, we know that we very often talk about the language of poetry. Because inversions, for example, grammatical inversions are very common in poetry. But if you were to use it in your answer books, you would immediately find a big red line under it. Because the structure that we use in prose, the structure that we use in everyday writing, in everyday speech, in everyday language, is necessarily different from the kind of language that is used in literature. Eagleton goes one step further and he tells us that it would be interesting to look at what the formalists had to say about the use of language in literature. How did the formalists attempt? The formalists, my dear students, a small group, very, very popular in the early part, in the first quarter of the 20th century. They lasted for about 15-20 years in a very, very big way. And then, somewhere along the line, their popularity as a group gradually began to wane till it finally disappeared. To them, the application of linguistics is what determines whether a work is literature or not. Let's look at what the formalists had to say about the approach to literature, about what makes literature. And they put it, in fact, very strongly when they say that what writers attempt to do is to work on language in such a way as almost making it stand on its head, he says. They condense, they twist, they intensify, they telescope, and they draw out language. Look at the words that are being used, words that we generally do not associate with language, words that we generally associate with things. But the formalists say that this is what writers of literature do to language in general. What do? They intensify language, they condense language, they twist language to exactly convey what they want to say. They also telescope language. That means sometimes they highlight something, but at the same time they can make something seem much, much smaller than what it actually is. But in order to do that, they need to use devices. And what are these devices? In ordinary language, we refer to them as figures of speech. I'm sure you remember some of the figures of speech that you've learned in different languages. In Hindi, Gujarati, or in Sanskrit, we call them alankar. And we all know that there are different kinds of alankar. Have you ever thought about it, my dear students? How these figures of speech, if you want to understand it better, think of it as alankar. How these different figures of speech are so common a part of our everyday language. Don't we all use comparisons when we say as cold as ice, as white as milk, as slippery as an eel? When you use all this, what are you doing? You're actually using a literary device. You are actually using a figure of speech. But what happens in literature? When a writer uses these, he uses them much more. And therefore, we become conscious, we become aware, we realize what the writer is doing to language. According to Eagleton, this is what the formalists believed gives literature a particular quality. This use of language, this use of devices is what gives literature a particular quality. What do they achieve, these writers, by using these devices? By estranging, by alienating, by making language stand on its head. According to the formalists, what it succeeds in doing is to make it strange. And it's a beautiful comparison that Singleton uses here when he says, we are not conscious of the oxygen that we are breathing. It's so obvious that you need oxygen in order to live. It's so obvious that you're breathing in oxygen every moment that we are alive. What happens when suddenly you are deprived of oxygen? It is in the same way that when language is twisted, we realize that language is being used in a different way. In this discussion, in continuing this discussion, we go on to say that language can be called a non-pragmatic discourse. He talks about how literature can be distinguished from the sciences which we consider to be pragmatic, and therefore literature can be non-pragmatic. Literature shows us that there is a specialized use of language. How do I know this? Because it is a context which tells me that this use of language is different from the everyday use of language. And therefore, according to Eagleton, having gone through the entire gamut of what the formalists say, having gone through what he thinks literature is not, having attempted to explain how in different ages we have come to different conclusions, different ideas about what literature is, having realized and having made us realize that very often a writer might be writing for a theme, but we might be reading the same writer for the style. This may not be in keeping, may not be in consonance with what the writer actually wanted to do. But yet, when we read it, we are reading it from a specific point of view. We are reading it for a specific reason. We are reading it because the writer has been able to make such wonderful use of language. And the examples that he gives, my dear students, takes into consideration the entire gamut of literature. Terry Eagleton is able to give us examples not merely from the well-known texts of English literature, from Chaucer and Shakespeare to Donne, to Dickens, to Cervantes, and to Animal Farm. It's not that he's only talking about George Orwell, but he also takes into consideration all the wonderful writing, the histories that have been written. He talks about Gibbon. He talks about Marx and Bentham. And in reading this essay, you will get a fantastic idea about what literature can be, what literature is attempting to do, and what, according to Terry Eagleton, are the main characteristics, the main ideas of what literature is all about. But I want you to remember that the conclusion that he draws is that literature is never the study of a well-defined entity. If you can think of entomology as being the study of insects, which gives us an exact point, literature is never the study of a well-defined entity. And the reasons he gives us, remember, is because the approach to literature is equally important. It changes. Literature is not, I want you to notice, unchanging and unchangeable. If it is not unchanging and unchangeable, what does it mean? Remove the two negatives and the answer that you have, that it is constantly changing and it is constantly changeable. What is